Okay, so for today's tutorial, we have again Katerina Eyre. She works, she's a PhD candidate at McGill University, and she will be going over BMORE analysis with us today. And yeah, it was very, very informative last weekend. So we're looking forward to today, and thank you again for presenting. So if you want, you can share your screen.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the introduction. You cut out a bit, so I'm hoping that my internet connection is stable. If not, just please someone let me know. I'll share my screen.
Sorry.
So here, I hope you can see my screen. So this is a software we use, CVI42, to do our analysis. I'm going to show today how we do the analysis for the OS CMR, which is the technique we showed how to scan last Saturday. So I hope you all remember. Just as a little refresher, the exam starts with 1 minute of free breathing. Then we do what's called hyperventilation when breathing with a metronome, and then breath holds. So I'll just put up on the screen an example of the images that we have. So what you can notice is that the image quality is poor, and then it gets a little bit better towards the end of the exam. And just to remind you, that's expected because while we're acquiring images during free breathing and especially hyperventilation, the patient is breathing, so there will be a lot of motion artifacts. Now, to do the analysis, what we're most interested in is the change going from right after hyperventilation. So when the image quality goes from being really poor to being good again, to the end of the breath hold. So what you can notice is, as I'm going through the phases here, I'm going through the cardiac phases of one slice, the image quality is very poor. I mean, you can barely even tell what's myocardium, what's blood pool, what's the right ventricle, what's the left ventricle. And then at a certain time point, you'll see a heart again. So just so that we're all on the same page, here's the left ventricle, here's the right ventricle. There's different ways of doing the analysis. I'm going to show you one of the original ways because that's the way I was taught, and that's the way I do it, and I don't have the newest version of the module. So in this CVI42 platform, what we use is called the perfusion semi-quantitative tool. And basically, we're going to just do the analysis at end systole throughout the breath hold. What we expect to see in healthy volunteers is a positive change in signal intensity. And in patients, we see no change in signal intensity. So the first thing we do is identify end systole for each cardiac phase. So that's when the blood pool is the smallest. So what we can see is when I go backwards, it's small. If I go back again, it gets a little bigger. Now I'm going forward, small, forward a little bit bigger. So I identify this phase as end systole. So I'm just going to go into the module and pull in this acquisition. So I'm going to do the same thing I just did. So I have to now find, I'm going through free breathing. This is hyperventilation. And then I'm going to get to the breath hold. Now, right after the breath hold, just some physiology, right after the breath hold, when they're doing the hyperventilation, the vasculature starts to constrict. So, and then as they do the breath hold, the vessels start to dilate. So they go from vasoconstriction to vasodilation. And essentially what we're measuring is kind of the change in oxygenation, because this is a T2 weighted sequence. From vasoconstriction to vasodilation in the myocardium, which gives us some indication on
Enter off playing.
Okay, I'm just going to assume that was not for me. That gives us some information on the microvasculature. Okay, so again, I'm just going to find end systole here, which is here, and then we draw the contours. So I don't know how familiar everyone is with drawing contours. Here, we do what's called simplified contours. So we don't include the papillary muscles into the myocardium. This is because for the calculation, we have problems with so-called partial volume effects. So when there's a pixel that's in the blood pool and in the myocardium, it sort of skews the calculation because, again, we look at signal intensity values. So we do kind of a conservative endocardial contour that's a couple of centimeters in from the blood pool. Then we do the epicardial contour. And again, we're a little bit conservative. So I'm just going to do it. I usually do it rough at first, and then I bring it out. So the edge of the myocardium is more here where I'm moving my cursor, but I bring it in a little bit just to avoid, again, those partial volume effects. The next thing we have to do is place the insertion points. So where the right ventricle inserts onto the left ventricle. So that's here, this point here, and this point is here. So we put these insertion points in, and then it sort of segments the myocardium. So this is segmenting by the AHA, so the American Heart Association segmentation model. And then we just continue. So then I go forward, and I'm moving forward. Again, the heart is going to go into diastole, and then again into systole. And it's not always going to be an equal number of phases apart. And that's because in the acquisition, we're doing prospective gating and not retrospective gating. So again, I identify this as end systole. So I just draw my endocardial contour. Then again, my epicardial contour. If I didn't have an audience watching me, I might do it a little bit slower, but for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to go rather quickly. And then I put my insertion points, and now you can see a line here. So on the y-axis is units of signal intensity, and on the x-axis is time. So I think it's in seconds. So at about 130 seconds, maybe 131 seconds, is when we identified the first breath hold and diastolic slice. And then about, maybe 12 seconds later, we found the next one. And this is showing the lines showing the change in signal intensity. So we usually measure the change across 30 seconds. So we're going to keep going. And diastole.
Unaonyesha hiyo ni live. Yeah, ni live.
So, and then we do the same thing. Insertion point, so the anterior insertion point, the inferior insertion point, and then we keep going. And diastole and systole. Same thing. Sorry, this is a little boring to watch, I realize. Trying to be as fast as possible. Insertion points, insertion point. And then we continue and diastole, moving to systole. I think it's about here. And at some point, the image quality may or may not get poor again. And this is likely due to the patient breathing again, unable to continue holding his breath after a certain period of time. So I'm just doing the same thing. And here, so we start to see something interesting here. So you can see if you look at this graph here on the bottom half, again, the y-axis is signal intensity units, the x-axis is time. And these lines represent the change in signal intensity over time. So what we're starting to see is a trend that we normally see from end hyperventilation, so the beginning of breath hold towards the end, we're starting to see a positive slope, so a positive increase in signal intensity. These different lines represent different segments of the myocardium. So again, you can see the white lines, the myocardium is divided into 6 segments. So we should see 6 lines. And this is what we generally expect in a healthy volunteer. So this is looking normal. When you don't get a curve that looks like this, so this analysis is very sensitive to certain things, like I mentioned, partial volume, being consistent with your phase selection, so always choosing end systole and not other phases of the cardiac cycle. So when you don't get a line like this, you can check to make sure everything is consistent before concluding that the patient may have an abnormal microvasculature. So just to continue here, so I think this is end systole.
Asking them that I wanted to order. The combo, the one that has combo, you not see.
Okay. And now we can see an increase again. These contours aren't perfect. Again, I'm just trying to go fast so that I don't bore you too much. So I'm going to do it just one more time. What we normally notice after about 40 seconds is that the signal intensity curve will start to plateau. That's why we have the patient or the subject hold their breath for about at least 40 seconds. Because we like to hit that plateau phase. So I'm just going to keep going. And sorry. I'll just do one more, and then, because I think you guys probably get the point by now, you just keep looking for end systole, keep drawing your contours, be a little conservative with the borders. And then put your insertion points. If you don't put your insertion point, these lines won't be drawn. So your anterior insertion point, inferior insertion point. And now we can go look over time. So this is kind of the change in signal intensity that we see for this volunteer. There's a little bit of abnormality about this range here. It might be because because of my contours or because I chose an incorrect phase. But in a nutshell, that's the analysis. And so you would get the % signal intensity change. Again, for volunteers, it would be positive, and that's what we normally report. Important things to note is that as of now, we validated this in patients with ischemic heart disease, so who have impaired macrovasculature, and have only started doing a validation in patients with microvascular disease. So this is still very much a research method that's currently being validated. So I just have a question. What are you looking at in drawing those circles in the short axis? So we're looking at the anatomy, essentially. So, okay, if I remove the contouring here, so this is the left ventricle, this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricular blood pool with the higher signal intensity, this is the myocardium. We're drawing the endocardial border. So the endocardial border, which is the boundary between the myocardium and the blood pool, the epicardial contour, which is the boundary between the myocardium and outside of the left ventricle. So the right ventricle here, and then the lungs and the extracardiac structures. So basically what you want to do is draw the border, but in a conservative way, so that you are not actually right on the border between the blood pool and the myocardium, or between the myocardium and the extracardiac structures, but rather inside about a couple of centimeters. So you see here, the border is actually here where my cursor is, but I've drawn the line inside. And again, that's to avoid so-called partial volume effects, where the pixels are mixed between the myocardium and another structure. So that's it. This is rather short and easy demonstration. And we'll keep it like that, because I'm sure you guys have seen a lot anyway. I can take questions if anyone has any. Otherwise, yeah, that's all I think I was meant to show today, right?
Yes. What maybe I
Thank you,
would.
Katerina. Can I come in?
Yes, yes. Francis, did you have a question?
Yeah, during the demonstration, I saw like, different color coding that you were trying to use, but I don't know what the yellow represents. During the demonstration, I think you use different color codings on the graph.
This graph?
Yeah, so the yellow one, what does it represent?
So they represent different segments of the myocardium.
Okay.
So you can see up here, for example, the yellow is the anterior septal part of the myocardium.
Okay.
Yeah, so the color coding is just up here.
And one question from my side.
And do you compare it to maybe a normal value or something on the graph, or they're just showing the segments? Those I'm not sure whether there's a normal code, color code there that you use the segment to compare.
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is, I'm just going to reiterate again, this is like a sort of a new technique that we're developing. So here, this is the original method that we were using. This is not normalized to any kind of normal value. So this is literally just showing a change in signal intensity over time. And now with the newer analysis that we're sort of testing and validating, we do normalize some of the signal intensity changes that we get to a cohort of normal values that we've obtained at McGill. But usually when we go to new centers, we first see if the normal values that we measure there are similar to the ones we initially used to evaluate at McGill. And again, like this new kind of measurements that we're doing, we're still just kind of developing it and testing it to see if we're skewing any values or if they have meaning and so on. So
right. Yeah, thank you.
So as of now, there's not a definite plan of what will be done with these intensity values?
So there's a trend in general. A positive change in signal intensity over time indicates that the person has a normal microvasculature or normal vasculature, because as time goes on after doing the hyperventilation and the vessels basically go from vasoconstriction to vasodilation, there should be like kind of a rush. It's like opening, like an analogy, opening the floodgates. So there should be a rush of oxygen, which should increase the signal intensity. But in terms of defining sort of like quantitative values for what the signal intensity should be, that's sort of under investigation. Yeah, as of right now.
Okay. So if someone were not...
All right, and one question again. Where do you install that software? Is it at the workstation or the acquisition or both?
So we have, so like at our site, we have the software on a computer that's right beside our scanner. And a lot of our researchers also have the software on their private computers. So we can do it kind of both offline.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
And one more question again from me. So you said that you want the patient to hold it for the air for 40 seconds so that it can be so it can go back down. The intensity, I mean. Would you be able to tell if the patient was not able to hold their breath for 40 seconds through the intensity curve?
Yeah, so basically you want to have enough cardiac cycles so that you can see a change. So of course, if the patient holds their breath for 5 seconds, that's not enough to see anything because you'll just get one value and you won't see the change. So it's really like the change in values that has meaning. So of course, if the patient holds their breath for 30 seconds instead of 40, you can still sort of infer some information from that. But again, if the patient holds their breath for 10 seconds, sometimes even 15 seconds, it gets a little bit tricky to sort of infer any kind of change in value over time.
Okay, thank you. Well,
I think Wally had a question. Wally? You have a question?
Yes, I have a question.
During the analysis, are we using just only the breath hold and what's it called, acquisitions, and as well the number of phases that we require? What is the minimum and for the standard number of phases that we require for that? Is because I could see that if we're going in some slides, we use about 3 or 4 slides for the analysis. So how many number of phases is adequate for us to do?
Okay, yeah, nice questions. So do you want to just mute yourself? Your first question was about the breath hold analysis. So yeah, so as of right now, we only are doing analysis in breath hold because as you saw, the image quality is really poor in hyperventilation and during regular breathing for us to really do anything with those images. However, one thing that one of our colleagues is looking into is some motion compensation techniques to try and adjust for all the motion that's happening during the acquisition of free breathing and hyperventilation. So perhaps sometime in the future, that would be an analysis that it is an analysis that we're interested in doing actually, but for the time being, we're sort of limited with doing it in breath hold. To the second part of your question about basically the number of cardiac phases. So you need to keep a high enough, I wouldn't put a restriction on the number of cardiac phases per se, but more on the temporal resolution. So you need to have a temporal resolution that's sort of similar to your cine acquisition, which is between like 50, 60 milliseconds or less in order to capture kind of the cardiac motion. And usually that's about, 20 cardiac phases with a normal heart rate of about 60 beats per minute. That's usually between 20, 25 cardiac phases. But what's more important than the number of cardiac phases is the temporal resolution.
okay. Well, if there are no more questions, then I guess we can stop here. Thank you very much for your time and for walking us through this demonstration. I think it was very clear to follow. And yeah, if there's no more questions, I will
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. I hope it was informative. I'm sorry I kept it really short, but I hope it was informative nonetheless.
Yeah, it was. Thank you.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you.